Rolling Bones, the osteopathic podcast with your hosts, Dr. James and Dr. Dante. And we're coming back to continue our discussion from 2 episodes ago. We had gotten through a bit of Civil War history and the influence on that Civil War on medicine. And we even mentioned some Greek stuff and how fit some of those Greek statues are. But
speaking of Greek stuff, we took a segue to talk to some folks about daddy issues,
which we did. And if you haven't watched that episode 31, it's excellent. You should check it out. And in the meantime, we're moving our way forward in history as we discuss how Americans were innovating their healthcare system. They were shooting from the hip, as Americans are wont to do at times. A quick final reference to the Civil War. Even the hospitals got involved in the war. And it was interesting. A lot of the battles of the Civil War, they occurred near cities, as you can imagine, strategic cities of strategic importance. But there were no real major military hospitals as we know them today, no MASH units, nothing like that. So many of the hospitals that were dealing with the casualties from the Civil War were all civilian, and they were overwhelmed by not just the volume of casualties, but the types of casualties. Because, you know, when you're living in the mid 1800s, you get shot with a musket, you get shot with maybe a rifle, but you generally didn't get shot with a cannonball. And so these were some major issues. And what the hospitals faced on top of that is quite often they would save a life initially, and then infection would set in and take that life that was initially saved, maybe upwards of several weeks after the initial injury. So we saw this major issue, a crisis, if you will, for the hospitals. They weren't prepared for modern trauma. They weren't prepared to deal with these kinds of casualties.
It's funny you mentioned a lot of the Civil War stuff, because so knowing that this will eventually tie back into, so we never lost sight of that. We're trying to explore the osteopathic identity, so on and so forth. But we made the agreement that you kind of agreed with it by joining the show, a type of agreement with the listeners, that in order to describe and articulate the osteopathic thing in context, it's worthwhile to have a picture of the bigger medicine thing in context. And a lot of the phenomenon that directly led into Dr. A.T. Still, founder Dude's skill set, practical expertise, and knowledge that led to how he practiced medicine prior to doing the osteopathic thing is forged out of his experience through the Civil War, right? So there's kind of 2 parallel threads running in this one. Here's a story of medicine as it shaped in the United States. Then there's this side plot, which is actually the main plot, but hey, plots are hard. There's this idea that by exploring this, we set the background for exploring the foreground discussion, which is now in the background, of how does this create osteopathy, right? And then, from there, we move on to the next set of discussions.
Well, and it's common for us to discuss medical history in terms of discoveries. Discoveries of sulfa drugs, discovery of insulin, discovery of antibiotics, and
penicillin's my pet favorite just because the story is ridiculous.
Yeah. And there are plenty, penicillin's discovery, I think, is just about as ridiculous. Like, oops, hey, this is kind of cool stuff. But
I remember, the guy didn't believe it the first 2 or 3 times it happened. It was like, this can't possibly be a thing. And then after it kept happening, he's like, okay, this might be a thing. And enough people don't die. And he's like, okay, I'm on to something here.
I got it. By George, I think I've got it.
Yeah,
and we talk in terms of medical discoveries as medicine was and physicians and scientists were searching for answers and solutions to problems that they couldn't solve. And this was a direct influence on how we talk about history. But what we don't talk about very much is the provision of healthcare and how that changed and why it changed. There are a number of influences in the background to all of this that include things like labor and military service and financial and political forces at play that shaped our system today. And you could say that some of these forces at play early on led to the paradox that is the American medical system. The paradox that I see in that we have some of the most advanced technology and scientific institutions in the world, and yet we have such a disparity with actual healthcare outcomes, from infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, and lifespan. It just does not compete with other countries. So talking about this history, I think, is important. So we move on from the Civil War. We have a country that spans from sea to shining sea. We have a great expanse and a great divide both in wealth and access to resources, but also a geographical expanse that changes how we're going to need to do things. We spread out and also urbanize. We have, after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have slaves that are sent into sharecropping and then sent north into inner cities. And we have labor as manufacturing develops. All of these things influence how medicine was going to be provided. And how do we fund medicine? You know, we do some tongue-in-cheek, some laughing about chicken guts on bellies and some of the unusual treatments at frontier locations. But at the same time, it's pretty easy to pay for a chicken gut.
I said people paid for this. This was a business model as much as it was a service, right?
Right. Yeah, and quite often, you know, if you need a chicken gut, you already had a chicken. You didn't even have to pay extra for that. And who knows? You know, you get the guts and you also fry up the chicken. You have barbecue and treatment all in the same time.
Right. It's good that you mentioned the geographic expanse, because something that might not be intuitive, without knowing the I guess the punchline already, is why does the sea to shining sea comment matter in this discussion, which it actually does. The country was so large and travel so difficult that what ended up happening was various schools of medicine and various cultures of how to perform medicine were distributed across the geographic United States. What ends up happening is, along the East Coast, you have a very Franco-Germanic, European, essentially, medical system, greatly informed. That's how we end up with the Greek thing. Greatly informed by, and during the pre-recording, we're trying to remember all the threads that we spun together in the first episode. But there's that Wheel of Time reference again. Anyway,
as the wheel turns,
it's been a minute, but there was this idea that in the coastal states, and in this case, the East Coast, because the West Coast is not yet a thing. It's a frontier and badlands right now. But in the East Coast, there's this idea of medicine evolving into a profession, becoming something that's very erudite, becoming something that is to be looked upon with prestige. They were actually looking at it as a profession as opposed to a trade. Implication being that professionals and tradesmen are two different classes of person, right? There's this idea in, I guess, the old country, in Europe, basically, where to be a professional, there's a guild affiliation, there is a rank, there's a prestige, there's an honor, there's decorum involved with this. And there's this camp of physicians in the United States who wanted American physicians to carry that same social rank, right?
that gravitas.
Right, right. The white coating, the White Tower, and all that good stuff. Hey, there's a
Mhm.
second wheel time reference. The White Tower means something outside of Tarvalin, though. But to
True.
White Tower something, the high towering. That's the phrase. High towering, not white
The
towering.
ivory tower.
There you go. It's a high white tower, which is essentially Tarvalin. They thought
Mhm.
about this when they wrote this thing. But when you go to the frontier, right? You cross the Mississippi, right? But you're not quite in like Comancheria. You're not in the native, quote unquote, the Badlands where it's not yet America, but you're not in the urban lands. You're in the frontier.
Mhm.
The clout, the need for prestige, all of that like decorum, pomp, kind of falls apart, right? Your physician can't survive just being a physician. He also has to be probably a salesman, kind of a pharmacist. That wasn't a word back then. Probably also a farmer, et cetera, et cetera. But what ends up happening is the mode of practicing medicine is cheaper in the frontier because even the thought process of, they developed x-rays eventually. This is not in this timeline, obviously, but imagine trying to perform medicine away from your technology centers, away from your production centers, using only what's available in the local mom and pop general store in the time when electricity is just being developed.
And you
It
hope the
creates a
store
different
is well
culture.
stocked. Yes.
Right.
Yeah,
You get chicken guts.
you got chicken guts and whatever herbs are available and what the Native American population was willing to share with you if there were relations that were reasonably stable enough for that.
Right. But that differentiation is a consequence of our geography. Imagine if all of this happened in a tight space, right? This doesn't happen if the entire country is the size of New Jersey. You're too close to make this phenomenon happen.
Mhm.
But how big is the United States? One country, even at this point, compared to a large European country, this minus Russia, the size ratio is insane, such that you have this wide differentiation under the banner of technically one country. This matters because this is also the premise of why there's so many disparate, varying competing systems in the states, I assume, right? It's because the systems are geographically distributed, because the environments are radically different, you end up creating local phenomenon, but every local phenomenon aggregated together makes a patchwork system.
And these local phenomenon could build followers and generate local headlines so that you could develop hydropathic medicine, you could develop mesmerism, you can develop all of these different things. And then you finally start connecting these widely disparate places with the railroads and to some extent with the Pony Express. And these ideas can start spreading eastward. And now these erudite physicians of the East who are college educated
The
would
Tarvalin
have
witches.
exactly.
We're saying this lovingly. I'm from New Jersey.
We and I went to school in Philly, so with love to our East Coast friends for sure.
There you
And
go. Please don't deport me.
we will not report to deport.
Thank you.
And
But
so, with all of this, we have ideas that are spreading, but then we have some other forces. We have this industrialization that's going on in the United States. And the initial healthcare was not truly healthcare in the first place. The first truly group provided medical attention was sick care, not healthcare. And the reason for this was if you got sick and you were at work and you could not work, you were at risk of losing your wages, and your employer was at risk for losing a productive employee. So if you think about, you look at our healthcare system as it is now, and it really doesn't strike me as truly designed to maintain health. There is more attention now than ever before regarding preventive medicine, but that was not built into the system's DNA because it
let's call
was
that a
directly,
rebranding.
it is now rebranding for sure. But the system originally was not built to prevent illness. It was to prevent lost wages. And much of that was not due to illness in the first place. It was due to injury at work. Now, you could argue that some of that illness, some of the injury at work led to illness, whether it be chemical exposures, heat exposure, mechanical injury, crush injury, and all of the dangers of early manufacturing. And
I heard asbestos gives you mesothelioma.
yeah, right, the asbestos, benzene compounds, arsenic, all the lead, aka Flint, Michigan, right? All
Right.
of those heavy metals that we used in manufacturing because they were useful, they were relatively easy to use, and we didn't know that they were so dangerous.
Right. There's an innocence to this time, as cynical as it can be about a lot of it. There's a lot of things you don't know about various toxic chemicals back when you're just using them for production. Like, I joke about asbestos, but turn the clock back, was it 40 years? And that was used as insulation for housing.
That
And
was everywhere,
right.
everywhere.
And it was considered okay, not because it was some, there wasn't a mass conspiracy with some, asbestos conglomerate like, hey, we will poison all the humans. It was, it's cheap and effective. And if you didn't know that it was a problem, right? How much moral blame can we give to those who, used asbestos, or for even those who didn't provide protections from a thing that you thought was benign?
Right. I
Right.
mean, lead paint. Lead paint was everywhere because we didn't know that it was going to cause kids to have developmental issues because
Right.
they're eating that sweet flavored, sweet tasting paint.
But now we know, then we change. But the idea is that the thing we call the American healthcare system was built off of a premise of preserving the workforce. And that's a very different mission than cultivating health. Like that is a different presupposition at the level of what the field do, right? If my entire field's reason of being is because I can't French that no matter what. Like there's a way to say that in French, and I can't. I have family in Montreal. They'd listen to this podcast, they'd laugh at me. But if you premise the entire field on I will cultivate health and make exquisite, excellent, long-lived, and high-performing humans, that is a different set of presuppositions than I will maintain the workforce such that illness and injury doesn't rip them out of productive labor. And neither of those goals are bad goals, right? The
Right.
problem is that this is why cameras are nice. I can do things like this now. The problem is that the pursuit of excellent human specimens, right? The cultivation of health, the Adonis, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
is pursued under a foundation of preserving the workforce. And now we have two reasonably opposed goals competing for the same cognitive space and resources.
And who's going to win out? Well, the folks who have the most money are going to win out, honestly, because as you think about Sickcare, it doesn't include children for the most part. And once someone leaves the workforce due to disability, retirement, just growing out of the age that you can work reasonably well, that sends you all out of the sick care type of pool. It's not something you have to worry about because the people with the money, corporations, politicians, and whatnot, they're worried about keeping people working. They're worried about GDP and economy, rather than the more idealistic, should we call it idealistic? The idea that we should be just maintaining a good health in all patients and all people of all ages versus
I will say exported.
Productive. Exported.
Yeah.
There we go.
Because I can't, so I can be cynical about both and idealistic about both, right? Like it's not to say that the prevention of illness and injury isn't worthy, because that's its own set of things. Now we have occupational med, OSHA. That's not to say that the public good of health is not valuable. We have the public health systems, which, to be fair, have been neutered by our medical system. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, our public health system was quite powerful. And then the AMA, there's a lot of stuff happened. but basically a lot of the power to do good that was housed in public health got eliminated because a lot of those functions got reabsorbed into actual medicine as such. And
Mhm.
in doing so, the incentive structures changed because medicine as such, again, going back to that premise, is targeted towards sick care. Public health is targeted towards the prevention of illness. But when the prevention of illness becomes recategorized as a disease state, things get weird really fast. And you end up with diagnoses like prediabetes. But
Well, and
yeah,
you start talking about public health as it refers to regulations, and then people hear the R word, regulation, and think, "Oh no, they're going to take my freedoms."
right.
And
But
then you get people fighting whether or not you should wear masks during the 2000 or during the 1918 flu, and you realize people haven't changed much in the succeeding 100 years.
see, this is where I get back into our groove with the podcast. There was a song in Frozen 2 about how some things never change, but everything changes. By the end of the song, nothing actually changes. It's a whole situation.
Right.
But going back to the original idea, there's this idea that once upon a time in American medicine, the thing that we now call healthcare was built upon a foundation of sick care. And sick care was not necessarily sick everybody, it was sick workers. That background knowledge is a critical piece to understand about our system, because one of the big questions that anybody should be asking is, why the heck is my access to medicine in the modern era tied to my employment? Like, what is the logic of, wait, I don't have a job, therefore I don't deserve to be healthy? That's kind of the implication of the statements, right? But
Well,
without knowing the history, it's nonsensical. To be fair, I don't like it, but there was a way we got there.
and what's interesting about that same time, there were these things called sanitariums, and Dr. Still ran one. The founder of Kellogg's cereals, his brother ran one. Post cereals founder actually went to one, and the
I
idea
didn't know
behind a
that.
sanitary, and that's how he discovered making cereals would make him money. He learned from Kellogg and then came out and formed his own cereal company, Post. And these sanitariums, their emphasis was health, wellness, prevention of illness. But the problem with all of these situations was funding, finances.
Who's going to pay for this?
Who's going to pay for that? You could only pay for it if you were well enough off to pay for it, unless you were in a frontier town where you could barter for it. But many of these sanitariums were frontier, Michigan, Missouri, whatnot. But there were places, other places in the U.S. But ultimately, they didn't last. And I suspect, and this is some conjecture on my own, they didn't last because there was no way to fund them in a sustainable way. And then we get the turn of the century, the industrialization continues on. You got the roaring 20s, and then the bottom of the economy falls out. And this led to some teachers at Baylor University, along with the Baylor University Hospital, coming together in Texas. Go Texas.
Oh,
right?
Man.
They says, hey, you know what? They come to the hospital and say, there's a group of us that want to pay a monthly fee to you, essentially. And in return, if you take this subscription from us, we would like to use your hospital as needed. And the Baylor Hospital said, okay, yeah, we can do that. They set up a health insurance of sorts. They called it Blue Cross. And
These words are starting to sound familiar.
I think you'll all be familiar with this. Now, physicians saw this. I said, now, wait a second. If these hospitals take all of these patients and provide care for all of these patients, what's that going to leave us? How are we going to provide ongoing care outside of the hospital system? And what's more, how are we going to get our patients into these hospitals if we don't have a part in this? And so the physicians and in the area formed into a similar kind of group, and they called it Blue Shield. And Kaiser, I believe, formed in a similar type of setup out in the West about the same time, as well as a few others. And all at this point, there were already life insurance corporations. And Blue Cross was originally not calling themselves an insurer, but they were taken to court, and a court ruled that they were indeed an insurance setup. And so they had to say, okay, we're insurance. And so going back to the uncertainty of these teachers about whether or not they were going to have access to healthcare because of a depression that was going on, they came and used their power as a group to come together and provide a resource to help them as teachers. And one of the reasons that the hospital was willing to agree to this is because these were teachers. They were young, they were healthy. So because they were young and healthy, this was not so much of a financial burden to the hospital, right? The hospital could say, well, this is a great deal. They're going to pay us $5 a month, $1 a month, some crazy small number. It's going to make us constant income, and we are rarely going to have to pay anything in return, provide very few resources in return. And so this became a business model, the foundation for the business model that we see today, that is healthcare. And this would set in motion all of the machinations that would lead to modern healthcare. And in the 1960s, we see an extension of this, where what the public realized is we have workers, we have teachers, and we have folks in manufacturing. They're working, they're receiving their quote unquote healthcare, but then they're retiring. And that group plan goes away. And maybe they have pensions, maybe not. And even if they do have pensions, are these pensions going to pay enough to take care of them in their old age? Because as we know, when do medical bills really pile up? When you're older and
I was gonna
you've
say
lost. Go
exactly
ahead.
kind of going in that idea, the context for some of these costs. So we've jumped a couple timelines. We've moved from the Civil War era. We kind of glanced through the 20s, 30s, the Great Depression. We're kind of jumping to the 60s. So let's play with some of the developments in this time period. We've escaped between Civil War to basically post World War II era, right?
Mm-hmm.
We now have a concept of antibiotics. That's new. We have a concept of surgical ward. That's actually relatively new in this timeline, versus what was happening in a tent in some random battlefield. You know what I mean?
Aseptic technique and anesthesia was really
Exactly.
coming into its own.
We're developing various new technologies. Now, this is something I don't know sincerely. I don't actually recall when the X-ray was developed.
X-rays was early 1900s. I think it was around actually the turn of the century when
Perfect.
Roentgen developed the first X-ray.
Cool. I knew it was
His
around.
X-ray was an oopsie too.
Yeah, that's hey, check out this machine that lets me see bones. Boop, 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 boop. Cancer. It's yeah. Goddamn.
But
Anyway,
man, cool. Look at my bones.
I mean, it is pretty cool. It's just, radiation exposure. But the reason I bring this up is, so why do these hospitals matter? And why do these costs matter is a big question. Because if the timeline is roughly Civil War era, then our medical therapies are amputation, chicken guts, and Cinnabar, which is pretty cheap. Cinnabar is what we use to make mercury, aka called quicksilver, yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't called it Cinnabar on the show yet, but by the way, that's where you get it from. But we have moved away from that era, and now we have penicillin, we have insulin actually at this point in time. We have insulin now, don't we?
We have
We have
insulin.
X-ray machines. We have some low-level anesthetics. We have the ability to create septic fields. We have the ability to do general surgery. We are in the beginnings of the modern medicine field, modern medicine timeline.
We have access to more opiates and cocaine, amongst
That
other
too.
things.
But the reason this matters is a lot of these things are products of industrialization, right? Like you don't have an X-ray machine in your horse and buggy.
Oh man, I can imagine you're going to Amish, Pennsylvania, and seeing an X-ray machine being pulled by a horse and buggy.
Right, right. These are
That's
big
quite
machines.
yeah, and they require significant resources to run with electricity and
like
training
coal
and whatnot.
wires.
Yeah.
But the reason all this matters I wanted to bring all that up because there's a reason costs are become big, right? Once upon a time, it would cost you some reasonable proportion of your monthly earnings to afford medical care because the medical care was cheap and ineffective. But now medicine is becoming quite effective, right? We can stop pneumonia now because we got penicillin, but man, that X-ray costs some electricity. And between the time, the investment, the material cost, the capital investment of those who built the hospitals, they need to recoup and create a profit because let's be real, it's a profit motive. And now that cost theoretically would be fronted by the patients, but there's no way for a patient to afford all these services. Hence the need for collective bargaining, hence the need to share the costs among your colleagues, co-workers, right?
And there are more specialists now. You have to have someone who specializes in running the machines and interpreting the results, and you have labs becoming more reliable, and so that adds to the costs as well.
Right. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention pathology. We can now do things like histology. We can dye things and like we can slice stuff and look at things with microscopes and whatnot. Pathology and radiology are beautiful fields, but they take resources. They cost things. And now Joe Schmo with a horse and buggy with some chicken guts isn't good enough.
Ain't gonna cut it.
Right. But the cost goes up as such. So part of the thing I wanted to bring up is there's a reason medicine started to become so expensive. And keep in mind, all of this is prior to the insane price gouging that happens in the modern era. This is the genuinely appropriate, honestly, price increases because the tech has gotten big. We are now at a tech level of medicine versus, voodoo witch magic.
Voodoo,
so
you do what? Remind me of the babe.
There you go. The babe with the what?
The babe with the power.
What power?
Power of voodoo.
We're gonna stop this now. There's a copyright issue here, man. But I wanted to bring all that up because now we have a context for why insurance matters. Okay, so the thing is, everybody in this timeline, right? When you say health insurance, we say, "God damn it," because we are in
another prior authorization.
Right, we are all in the cynical phase of American insurance, but this is a timeline. Let's put it to 1950s, 1960s. Blue Cross Blue Shield was something that your priest at your church would help you sign up for because it was an act of service. This was something that people used to go to lodges to like commiserate, to make friends or whatever. And like your lodge buddies or whatever, I don't know what those are called, but your lodge friends or whatever would collectively sign up for these things together because it was the cool thing to do. So like, this is not the time when people were like, oh, God damn it, I need more insurance. This was the smart, responsible thing to do. Me, my middle-class self, is to get some health insurance because God forbid I get injured. These guys are out here to help me. The attitude of this time is about as saccharine as the 1950s because it's the 1950s.
This is the Donna Reed of medicine.
Cool. Just to get the vibe right, okay? Because once you get to about like 1970, 1980, it's these insurance companies are evil. Burn them all. But we're not there yet.
Yeah, and that's when the book House of God comes out and accurately describes how people are feeling at the time.
Right. We don't have Aetna yet.
Oh, yeah. Now, what's interesting about all of this, we're talking about the financial implications of the specialization and the technical developments. What we also see is a number of different groups saying, I want a piece of the pie. You have the allopathic, aka MDs, you have the osteopathic DOs, you have chiropractors, you have naturopaths, all vying for a piece of the medical income pie. And you have a very effective American Medical Association that did a wonderful job for their members, their group members, making sure they were going to get paid and they were going to take a leading role in the development of this medical field. And you can understand, we've had some bit of a discussion about the medical purge that happened as a result of the Flexner report and the ongoing battles between the American Osteopathic Association and the American Medical Association. But in reality, this was a huge battle for a major financial reward in reality. So much so that the AMA particularly was successful in keeping osteopathic physicians out of the military during World War II and the Korean conflict. But what happened during those conflicts was osteopaths stayed home, chiropractors stayed home, and they built up businesses and they built up incomes successfully. So when their MD colleagues came home and realized, wait a second, what did we do, right? We left home and it was ripe for the development of these other professionals. So Vietnam comes around and the military, well, they're going to start drafting doctors because they need doctors. And they had initially told DOs, no, we're not going to take you because you're not doctored, right? And it took the AMA saying, now, wait a second. I remember what happened in World War II. This isn't going to happen again. You guys need
Don't
to
play yourself.
You guys need to take DOs too into the service. And I remember talking to some of my professors who were practicing physicians during this time. They talked about how it changed for them when they were finally able to serve in the military. And that changed, it seems like that changed everything for a public perception of physicians that are trained as osteopathic physicians. To the point now that even though only 15 to 20% of physicians in the country are osteopaths, the last data I heard was that upwards of 40% of the physicians in at least in the Air Force were osteopaths or are osteopaths.
That's actually, I knew the first bit of the story. I didn't know that statistic about the 40%. That's actually really cool.
Yeah, if you want to get treated by a DO, join the military. You
Join
get
the
a
Air
better
Force.
chance. You'll have a better chance of being treated by a DO when you're in the military than when you're in the civilian world.
That is actually really cool. So obviously I know. So we both come at this having similar reading, but we know little bits of. We differentiate in our knowledge to some degree, which keeps the show interesting. That's actually really cool. I had no idea. Saying this from the perspective of a large amount of my colleagues in med school went down the military pathway in their training, right? And for all of my med school buddies who are now in the military, it's funny you mentioned how many of us joined the military. And I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense now that I think about it. There was a very big presence of the US Army and Navy specifically where I went to school. And it was kind of like, hey, it's those guys. Like it didn't feel weird to have them around. It was like, no, that's one of our training pathways. For those who want to do that, go do that. And that was a sizable amount of our cohort. What's interesting to me is this idea that we didn't become real doctors in the public perception until we became recognized by the US military, because that doesn't necessarily mean anything as far as our medical expertise, but it tells you something about how Americans perceive the military, right? You're legitimate when the military respects you. There must be something to it. I say that because admitting my own biases, so this is escaping the bounds of this discussion a little bit. I had a very lukewarm attitude towards acupuncture for the longest time. It's like, there might be something to it, might be some magic stuff. Who knows? Like I came in agnostic. And I remember
Right.
the first thing that made me go, you know what, there might be something to this. I'll pay attention. At the very early phase of my training was some guy saying, hey, there's this protocol called battlefield acupuncture we learned from some folks. And I'm like,
Yes.
hold up,
Wait a
what? And he
second.
goes, right.
Battlefield acupuncture?
And it's not even that it
Yeah.
sounds cool, because like it sounds cool, whatever. But it's not even that it sounds cool. It's wait, some random dude is doing acupuncture in the middle of like the desert for some special forces, whatever, and they're saying it works. And I'm like, okay, you know what? Maybe I'll give it time of day. All this to say,
Well,
I'm clearly as American as the story is. You know what I mean? Like, once you say the military's down, I go, you know what? Like it or not, there might be something to it, which is an interestingly American phenomenon. I don't think other countries
mhm.
necessarily have that association of, if approved by government violence system, then there must be some mark of quality.
This is a very good point. And this definitely separates us from the rest of the developed world, at least when it comes to osteopathic medicine. But the truth is that much of our medical knowledge and medical innovation has come about through the military, through war. Actually, war tends to drive innovation. And
I have
we
bought
talked
so
about
much quick clot.
Civil War, but what's that? Oh yeah, quick
What's that?
clot. Yeah.
I've bought so much quick clot.
Modern tourniquets, medications, surgical techniques in particular.
Yeah.
Well, and because you have lots of ways of trying new things when you're in the battlefield, you just got to get the bleeding to stop.
We are now echoing back to the beginning of this episode. We're talking about the Civil War. There's this idea that, for better or for worse, right, there's no moral assessment of this phenomenon. The pressure of war seems to create innovation, because the whole point is to survive at that point, right? The extremis
Mhm.
of that scenario forces new things to occur or die, quite literally. And in the same way that the hospital systems and our surgical techniques got a massive upgrade because of Civil War level trauma, in a similar sense, the changes in our medical field to assimilate basically the awkward step cousin DOs into the field was out of the scenarios that got built out of modern war, which is, it's a weird way to spin our story. I haven't thought of it that way before, actually.
It's interesting how that developed. But to circle back to our time in the 50s and 60s, we realized, okay, we're doing a pretty decent job taking care of workers and maybe their families while they're under our group plans. But what do we do with the old folks?
We forget about them. We toss them over the tar pit.
Forget about them. Yeah.
Remember that episode, Dinosaurs? You get,
I'm not dead yet. I'm
but
feeling
you're gonna
better.
be.
I want to go for a walk.
Oh man, bring out your dead.
Bring
These are
out your
references to
dead.
old shows for our age shows in this conversation, by the way. Um, once upon a time, there was a show called Dinosaurs, and when you got old enough in Dinosaurs, you got thrown over the tar pit
Mm-hmm.
because the characters were dinosaurs. And then further back than that, even before my time per se, was a show called Monty Python, and they had jokes about the plague. It is lovely. Bring out your
And
dead.
bring out your dad.
That might
She's
need
a
to be the name
witch.
of, like, we might need to start a band and like drop that as a single. Just bring out your dead. Like we could
Oh
thrash to
man,
that, right?
we could do that. We could do
All
we
right,
could
all right.
totally jam to that.
New side project. All right. Anyway, um, all this to say, in the 1950s, we had to sort out what to do with our old folk, because, as you know, in this country, again, this is a very American-based episode because we're dealing with American history.
Mhm.
We're not kind to our elderly, and this shows at this level of decision making. It was this idea that once you're old enough to be out the workforce, you're technically not a problem anymore. Go die.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, your family was expected to take care of you. Your community was to some extent, and there were some community organizations that did help, but there was no really organized effort to provide care in the same way that the young, productive members of society were receiving care.
right.
And because of this, and this happened also at the same time of, the Great Society movement, the war on poverty, Uh, we won't get into the politics of all of that kind of stuff, but at the same time frame, there was the idea that, okay, we're going to need to find some way to care for the elderly, because one of the side effects of modern medical innovation is people living longer, right? People not dying at childbirth nearly so much, people not dying from injuries nearly so much, people not dying from infection nearly so much. So what are we going to do when someone lives to retirement age? And
Right. You are now old
yeah,
enough to suffer.
yeah,
Deal
from
with it.
chronic stuff, and people smoking like crazy, drinking like crazy. So they're having all of these chronic issues that we didn't have good solutions yet. You know, lung cancer and emphysema and all of these kinds of things. But they're
Because
living longer
technically they didn't
because
matter.
they didn't matter. Because,
You died first of something else, like
yeah,
sepsis.
childbirth, sepsis, falling somewhere, breaking a bone. Yeah, yeah. I mean, just there was lots of ways to die on the frontier that were not happening anymore in the 1900s. And so we finally came together and said, okay, well, let's make a group plan for all the people that can't afford a group plan, and we'll call it Medicare and Medicaid for younger folks in the in certain circumstances.
For
And
clarification, because those are very clear words with you and I, the Medicare was written as the group plan for the elderly,
mhm,
and Medicaid was written, roughly speaking, as the group plan for the destitute. It was meant as the poverty plan.
exactly,
Um, they've
and
morphed a little bit, but
and
this
the
is how they started.
disabled and whatnot.
Yeah.
What was interesting about that is you get the Centers for Medicare, and they start having an influence on medicine in the ways that medicine was going to be funded. They started saying things like, we're not going to pay that much for that service, or we're not going to pay at all for that service. At the same time, other groups started coming out with health maintenance organizations, HMOs, um,
We're starting to say modern
sim-
words.
starting into the modern world, and they were more built similar to Medicare, Medicaid as a group, where you would have now in network providers. You know, we kind of lost the prestige of the word physician, because physician has been slowly eroded into providers, which I'm not a big fan of, but you hear that all the time. Um, but again, none of the emphases of these organizations, the emphasis of Medicare was not prevention. The emphasis of Medicare was take care of the sick and old, because they're already sick, because they're old and they haven't prevented illness yet, because that wasn't the emphasis. So
Right.
again, we look at what these systems did, and they were still providing sick care, but now the sick care was not for the sick working, it was for the sick non-working.
And
So
the
now we
sick.
have,
Yeah, yeah, you got it. Yep.
yeah, I was just gonna say, so now we just spread out sick care, we didn't spread out healthcare, if you will. But you were saying?
Well, I thought your sentence was going to go somewhere else. There's like a little lag time between, we're online. I thought you
Mhm.
were going to say for the elderly. I didn't realize you were going to say for the unemployed. So no, we're good. We're good. We're good.
Good,
I'm
good, good.
agreeing with this
Yeah.
idea that Medicare, Medicaid was designed to essentially distribute the benefits of pretty damn effective sick care over a wider population, which is not the same as saying preventive care or wellness or something of that nature.
And there was not nearly the emphasis on how do we get to be old without being sick, right? How do we get through our productive years without losing significant capability from a wellness side? We're not trying to prevent illness. You know, a lot of what we do in our clinic is trying to catch disease processes early on before they become a problem, before they become a true disease, right? But there wasn't much of that going on, and so you see
You're
the
alluding to our
current.
osteopathic heritage now.
Exactly. Uh, and what was interesting about all of this is osteopaths see the trends. They got their finger to the wind, and they're throwing up the grass, seeing the which way it's blowing, and they're going, well, we can either play the game or we can be left in the dust. And if left in the dust is what was going to happen, that means extinction, truly. And so in order to protect the heritage and the profession, they decided to play the game. And I have to say, I'm glad they did, because we wouldn't be here today. This would not be a podcast today. We wouldn't be here having these discussions
I'd
if we
probably be an
didn't
engineer.
play the game. I would be a computer programmer.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I could see it.
I just about bricked my new computer last night until I played with the BIOS, but that's another discussion for another day.
You understand me. But
although that being said, a lot of what we do is playing with your metabolic BIOS. So I'm just saying.
There's a reason the tech nerd and the wannabe engineer end up becoming DOs. And that's actually worth considering. So up front with the baggage of our field, for a lot of folks, becoming a DO is like a backup option to becoming an MD. No shame there. We know this. We're aware of this, right? We talked about that in episode 2. But for me at least, this was an active decision to pursue this route, because what I saw in osteopathy, if you guys recall from earlier discussions on the show, was this weird place where medical care, or the pursuit of health, was being performed in a way that was not completely incompatible with an engineered mindset, as opposed to a strictly medical mindset, medical now taking on the connotations we needed to, describing what medicine has evolved into, right? Like the
Absolutely.
concept of sick care doesn't necessarily exist at the level of find health, but find health itself needs to be articulated. That's its own identity, right? But yeah, the DOs decided to play the game, and osteopathy became osteopathic medicine, and cosmic powers and all that good stuff. By joining the system, what ends up happening is now we have physicians trained osteopathically as opposed to osteopaths, and that title shift, right, from being an osteopath to being a physician who practices osteopathy, now it's called osteopathic medicine, has a very interesting tension, which we've explored multiple times, right? But
absolutely. And here we are. And I am glad we played the game, because now we are in the system, and we
can
have
get paid for our services.
We can pay for our service. And on top of that, we can influence the system in ways that we couldn't if we were in any other field. If we were outsiders and we were just doing osteopathic stuff in the community, it's not to say our osteopathic colleagues in other countries don't have influence. They do, and they do great work. I just think that with us in our current place, it's a good thing we played the game, because that gives us additional opportunities to see patients in ways that we couldn't.
That's actually a recurring theme with you and I, like you and me specifically. For example, the work. So a lot of the work that you and I do clinically, like at our day job, really lives in the cash space. Like at a very honest level, half of what we do closes in on concierge medicine, at the level of the nuts and bolts. But by playing in the system, in staying within the traditional medical system, we get to more people. We get to do it in a way that we wouldn't be able to do if we were to fully embrace this punk rock maverick version of us, right? That
we got no satisfaction.
There you go. You understand me. There's something to be said about being in the system just enough to influence the system and undermine it just enough to make it better, which is a recurring trend with at least you and I, right? Both in our field and in our choice of employment, actually, now that you come to think about it. But that is something that is a borderline central tenet. That means something else now. Never mind. That is a borderline axiomatic presupposition to how the DOs converted from being osteopaths to osteopathic physicians in the United States. The idea of getting the system just enough to infiltrate and exist.
And now within that system, this modern system that is still based on the premise that we should be treating sick people rather than we should be producing healthy people. There is a great deal of tension right now on how do we go about creating a healthy society versus just taking care of sick patients. And what is our role as an osteopath and as a physician in producing a healthy society? Because we see this even in our clinic. There's not nearly so much of a financial incentive to be producing healthy people, because if people are healthy, they're not coming in.
CMO, man.
Well, I remember a conversation I had with a nurse while I was active duty. She was a civilian at this point. She had been active duty at one point. And this is what happened at a clinic that she worked in. They had this great idea that when a military family would move in, they would have a meeting with the family. And they would tell the family, okay, these are the indications for coming to the doctor. These are what you want to look for symptom-wise. If you don't have these symptoms, don't come in, you'll be fine. And it worked amazing. It worked amazing, so amazing that they had visits drop significantly. And then the administration came to them and said, what did you do? People aren't coming to the clinic. We can't prove your value. We can't prove that we need as many physicians as we have because we're not having visits. So you know what they did? They canceled the classes. They canceled the classes because
it's an interesting thing because that echoes. Oh, sorry. Finish your story, please.
Because there was no financial incentive. There was no incentive to prevent people from coming to the doctor.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I provide my, I guess, health pursuing services to differentiate from sick care medical services to my patients, right, at our day job. But taking a moment to make sure, no, this is fine. Okay, cool. Had to think about it for a second. I am explicitly less productive from a money generation standpoint, prioritizing this wellness thing, than I am prioritizing the treatment of pathology. And keep in mind, even in the context of me so a lot of what I do clinically, a lot of you and I do is what we get patients physically stronger. We try to get them off their medications. Like existing in the sick space, I focus on fatty liver disease. I focus on type 2 diabetes. I focus on obesity, right? In the language of sickness, those are the things I treat.
And those are the source for a vast number of other illnesses.
Right. But we found out, as ridiculous as this is, if your patients get well enough that they don't need to be on their medications for their type 2 diabetes, you actually lose out on money because we're rewarded for giving them medications for their type 2 diabetes. So, for example, and keep in mind, this is not a conspiracy. This is not like a bad guy type of situation.
No,
what's happening is, right, when the system is built for pathology, you have assumptions built into the payment structure, right? For example, if you have a disease that is likely to give you a heart attack, type 2 diabetes, then one of the things you ought to do to protect your patient with the sickness is to give them something called a statin so that you can protect them from the probability of the heart attack. Fair enough. We can critique that. We can comment on that's a different discussion. But the logic of that is sound, right?
Right.
Now, the alternative is, what if you just got rid of their diabetes so that they don't need the statin, so that they don't get the heart attack, which is also a very fair line of thought. Right.
Yeah, stop the presses. It's revolutionary.
Right. But what we found out,
what
we found out was we actually get paid less for doing that because the bells and whistles we need to hit in the system to get paid don't have a presupposition where the removal of disease is even possible. The absence of disease is a non-entity. It's a zero state in the game, such that it doesn't even go on the board, such that you can't even get paid for it because it didn't happen.
Right. I mean, going on this example of diabetes, if someone's hemoglobin A1C is above 7.5, We recommend, or the current recommendations are to recheck that A1C every 3 months. And if that A1C continues to be elevated, they're coming in for visits on a regular basis because their diabetes isn't controlled. So what if you have a patient who has A1C of 10? You're talking about getting on insulin. You do some basic dietary changes and add exercise, and you see them in 3 months and their A1C is 7. And then 3 months later, their A1C is 5.5. They don't have to follow up with you anymore nearly so frequently. They're not taking so many meds. Quite often get them off meds. So where is the income for the clinic in that? Where is the profit to the pharmaceutical companies in that model? I mean, even thinking about that from an insurance company, you would think insurance companies would be saying, "Hey, yeah, that's great. You're making us profit because we're not paying so much," but they don't tend to think of things in that way.
Right.
And
These are actually the negotiations I'm having in the day job lately, trying to show insurance companies, you know, in a very formal sense, this is the value of the osteopathic thing. Like at a very technical level, like I'm going to go into World of Warcraft speak for just a second because I don't know how else to convey this at a high level. So in World of Warcraft, wow, World of Warcraft is an MMORPG. That's fancy word for a bunch of folks doing nerd things in a video game.
Massive multiplayer role-playing game.
There you go. One of the roles you can play in this game is a healer. So like some people want to play characters that do damage. Some people want to play characters who tank damage, as in protect other characters from damage. Some players, I'm a doctor, no surprise, want to play healers. Think about that, actually. So I liked playing healing characters. I rolled a priest, basically. And in the priest role, there are 3 builds. One of them doesn't matter for this because it's a shadow priest. It actually does damage. It's a DPS class. It's fun, but it's not what I'm talking about. You can play I think it was holy or protection. I forget the words. Point being, you can heal 2 ways in that game. You can either heal damage that has occurred, as in guy got hit, fix him up, or you can provide buffs, bonuses, armor, and things of that nature,
right?
Such that the damage
make
never
other players
happens.
Stronger.
Right.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
Both of those builds are completely valid. And depending on the scenario, both of those builds are better at different scenarios, right? But it's easier to show the value of that in a video game because it's literally a video game. They can track it. But in real life, it's as if the system is only designed to track the healing of damage, but there's no concept of, what do you mean the damage never occurred?
That's
like there's
true.
There's no way to show
like,
you mean the damage never occurred.
You mean we prevented it in the first place?
Right. And that's an existential problem for the Sickcare system, because we've learned at the level of medical care globally that in the modern era, so like now we're talking about the modern era right now, we're kind of past the point of trauma and infection, although antibiotic resistance, let's see what happens in 20 years. Right now,
and people still jump off of high things.
Exactly. Like dumb stuff happens, but it's not a public health emergency yet. Yet. But True. Right now, the biggest risk to our public health, as in population level pathology, is obesity, diabetes, sedentary behavior, and deconditioning. Like we're weak, obese, and we are quite literally getting sick off of our food. And like that is the problem of our era. And the way we fix that effectively is to ultimately stop people from getting there, which is fine. But how do you assess the value of a life not hurt? Like that sounds like a really cool, sounds like a lyric in a song. But
that's an interesting discussion to have, because for an insurance company, it makes sense to allow a 60-year-old to die of a massive heart attack, because that is an initial expense that's pretty high up front, because hospital stay, ED visit, all of that kind of stuff, and you do heroic medicine to try to save their life. But what if they live till they're 95 and they spend the last 10 years of their life in a nursing home, and they spend the last 10 years of their life going to a doctor visit every week or every other week, once a month, those expenses add up. So it actually doesn't make sense for an insurance company from a financial standpoint to help someone to live that long.
Right.
It actually makes sense for them to die quick, early, young.
Right. And look, that sounds perverse as hell, right? Like that doesn't sound like we care about the humans, because at this level of analysis, we actually don't, right? From a cost saving perspective, the game is to save costs.
What about our
com-
shareholders, Bob?
Right, right. The insurance companies, which are companies, are profit generating corporations, which are beholden to the rules of corporations. And it is actually written into law that a corporation must, decide and act for the benefit of its shareholders, which is not the same as perform a service, right? The corporation's job isn't to produce or to do per se, it's to bring value to those who own it. And
Exactly.
that is a different set of incentives, once again. And when the product of the corporation is the saving of money for those who invested to provide care, now all of a sudden the incentive becomes, how do we not provide care? And now we have the prior auth.
We're the only medication that works for this person because they've tried everything else.
Exactly.
But I think this is an important conversation that we need to definitely flesh out. How do we provide preventive medicine? I tell my patients all the time, I'm trying to get you to the point where you don't need me anymore. And I laugh and I say, it's not a great business practice, but it's great for you, because that's ultimately what we as healers are needing to do.
Yeah.
It's a true balance between taking good care of our clinic, because, and I tell our residents and our students all the time, if you don't keep the lights on and the windows and the doors open, and the windows for that matter, you can't take care of patients. But at the same time, there is some tension in that we need to take care of patients in such a way that they receive appropriate preventive care as well as heroic care.
Right. I joke that if I do my job right, I'll be out of business by my 40s, so I can go do something else like play my guitar, hang with some kids, build an AI. I don't know.
That's
you know
right.
what I mean? Like, there's other things out there. But the idea, if we're pursuing this to its logical endpoint, is if we do the osteopathic thing well, or rather, if we do the preventive thing we're doing well, at the highest level, the thing that makes us relevant should go away. And then we either find a new mission, or we, I guess, die of starvation, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't know what I would do if there was no diabetes as a physician. At the same time, I am actively motivated to make diabetes not a thing, because the second that thing is done, I'm going to hang up my shingle and find a different job. Like, what else am I going to do? Now, that's being said almost in a ridiculous fashion. There are, as far as one user is concerned, one person, there might as well be an infinite amount of people. So I can technically just make the job going through people up until my endpoint. That being said, you know what I mean? Is there a way to scale that?
And I think where we're taking this discussion in future episodes is how to scale it,
Right.
because ultimately one of the major tenets of osteopathic medicine is wellness of the patients, and this deserves further discussion. So
I was so hoping you were going to say find it, fix it, and leave it alone right there.
We are going to help find a fix for our unhealthy system, but we'll find it, fix it, and leave it alone. And thanks for joining us on the show tonight. And this evening, we are excited about where we're taking this. And everyone have a great week, and join us for our next episode of Rolling Bones, the Osteopathic Podcast.
Rollin' Bones, the Osteopathic Podcast, is brought to you by Drs. James Aston and Dante Paredes. We'd like to note that medicine is a constantly changing science and art, with various approaches from practitioner to practitioner. This podcast represents the Rollin' Bones doctors' views of osteopathic medicine and OMT, and will be as evidence-based as possible. Now, comments, suggestions, or corrections of errors are welcome, but no money from drug or device companies is accepted. By listening to this podcast, you agreed not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including, but not limited to, patients that you are treating. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This applies to the hosts, guests, and contributors to the podcast. Under no circumstances shall James Aston, Dante Paredes, or any guests or contributors to the podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast. Please visit us on Twitter at RollinBonesPod or send us messages at rollinbonespod@gmail.com. Thank you.